Great. Welcome. My name is Michael Chan, and this interview is for the Faith and Firearms Project on April 24th, 2015. I'm having an interview right now with a pastor, an anonymous pastor, and we're going to talk a little bit about guns and gun violence. Thank you so much, Pastor, for being willing to join me.
No problem.
Pastor, will you tell me just a little bit about why this project was interesting to you?
Well, I have found over the years that there have been a lot of thoughts that run through my head about guns, about violence in general in families and in society, and I haven't necessarily been able to jump on the bandwagon of any particular point of view. So I continue to ponder, and I just thought it would be an interesting conversation to have with you.
Great. Well, I certainly appreciate it. I think, you know, the best conversations that I've been able to have are kind of with the people who actually haven't come to decisions yet. Because, and especially when it's done under the flag of anonymity, I think it allows, allows a person to be kind of honest about those things. So thank you for acknowledging that from the beginning. Mm-hmm. You're a pastor, so you're a faith leader. I imagine you think a lot about faith and Christianity. Will you tell us a little bit about how, for yourself, you would respond to the question, what does it mean to be a Christian?
Well, for me, to be a Christian means to be a follower of Jesus, whom we refer to as the Christ. But this was the Jesus that I'm thinking about is the one who was who came down from heaven to accompany us here on earth in the midst of our human violence, who suffered at the hands of human violence, who was unjustly accused, who was executed by the state as an innocent man. And so with that kind of as a background, I see nonviolence, his own willingness to accept violence, to forgive, having experienced it, and not to retaliate, to be very important guidance for me in terms of my wanting to follow him.
Okay, so Jesus' own suffering on the cross provides for you a kind of ethical example of how to relate to violence.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
If I may add,
please.
I am also a member of a Franciscan religious order, and the Franciscans have a historic peace testimony. So at the time that St. Francis was forming his order of lay people, that's known now as the Third Order, there were a lot of city-state wars that were going on between small communities. Many, many people were suffering terribly from these. And so as part of the rule of life, so to speak, for that order, St. Francis said that no member of the Third Order would bear arms for any reason. So because I belong to that religious order, I myself have made a promise to myself that I will not bear arms for any reason.
Oh, I see. So it's part of in order to be part of that actual order, you have to make a commitment to not to bear arms.
I'm not actually certain that it's ever enforced nowadays, but that's my understanding. Part of my understanding of being a Franciscan is walking away from violence, from personal use of arms. And I had an experience in the Holy Land where there was a young Israeli soldier who wanted to come into a Franciscan church. And of course, as a soldier, she had to have her weapon with her at all times. And the Franciscan priest met her at the door and said, "I'm sorry, but in this house of God, no firearms are allowed. If you're willing to leave your firearm behind, you are more than welcome." And so she was not able to enter the sanctuary. And I totally respected that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that story. Pastor, will you just tell me a bit about your own history with firearms, whatever there may be, whether it's positive or negative, just whatever sort of comes to mind for you when you think about firearms?
I have been a human rights observer in the West Bank for a total of about 6 months over a period of several years and 4 different trips. One anecdote that I'll share is a time when I was in a team of 4 people, and we were on our way to a village which was in a rural area, and it was just women and children that lived in that village. Very, very small village, just 2 families. We were stopped by an Israeli military vehicle, and typically how these kind of traffic stops work, and this is what happened, is that one person got out of the vehicle and came to our window, and we had to roll down our vehicle and give our IDs. 2 other people got out of the vehicle and pointed their weapons directly at us during the interview, and the 4th person remained in the vehicle. So we were essentially being interrogated at gunpoint. I have had other situations while I was there of being asked pointed questions by someone who had a firearm. So I've had this experience. And at the end of this conversation, we were allowed to go. But it was interesting that as we began to go towards our village, we were told, "Be careful, it's dangerous out here." And after the soldiers left, we had to laugh because we were going to visit women and children, and we had just been held at gunpoint by the people who were telling us that there was a danger involved, which has to make you wonder about the role of the firearms in the first place. It's the role of how does having a firearm aggravate the situation or further inflame the situation?
Did you all grow up around guns in your family?
No, I wouldn't say so. Yeah, my brother served in the military. There just happened to be some weapons in the home. You know, some of them may have belonged to other family members even. But they weren't, I mean, it wasn't that we necessarily even knew that much about them. We knew they existed.
Okay. When you think about, so within America, guns are it's a very complicated issue. We even talked about this in the pre-interview, how you really can't even talk about sides, or it's actually unhelpful, really, I think, for discourse to kind of label sides and things like that. So it's such a complex symbol, I think, within culture, and has many different valences and meanings. But as you think about guns for yourself, what do they symbolize for you personally?
Well, that's an interesting question, because of course the whole hunting thing comes up, and in the community where I grew up, hunting is a big deal. And so, you know, on the one hand, I think of them that way, but truthfully, I mostly think about guns from the point of view of human conflict. And that's largely because I've spent so much time in the West Bank, and I've experienced being in the presence of large numbers of armed people. And I just know that there's a lot of anxiety related to the presence of that many firearms, that it's the potential for things to change rapidly, to explode, to become violent is there. And I just find myself very uncomfortable in general around firearms.
Do you know much about, this is a kind of an aside, but do you know much about the firearms laws in Israel, and maybe specifically with respect to Palestinians?
Palestinians are not permitted to bear arms. They don't have guns.
Okay. Yeah, I honestly don't know much about the laws there, but I figured you would have some insight on that, into that.
Well, the Palestinian Authority and the civil police, they do have weapons, but that's more or less to keep the peace. The general population of Palestine is not permitted to have weapons.
Okay. As you again think about the conversation in America around guns, or lack thereof, depending on how you think about it, what are some of the deep concerns that you have? You mentioned earlier, before we were on here, that you weren't quite certain you had worked out your own view, which is just fine. But maybe we could think about it in terms of some deep concerns that you have about the role of guns in American society.
Well, one concern that I would have is the prevalence of weapons in homes that aren't necessarily safely kept. You hear a lot of, not a lot, but you do hear occasionally of a child getting a hold of a gun and accidentally injuring themselves, or more often a sibling or a friend. So that's a concern. Another concern that I have has to do with the availability of weapons, with a person being able to get a hold of a gun without too much of a background check. There's been a big conversation, I would say, around the issue of tightening up gun control in this country, in terms of making it a little bit more difficult for people to get a weapon without a background check. It seems as though it's relatively easy for someone who might want to do harm to someone else to get a hold of a gun. Recently, I was at a conference of activists, and there was a table where you could pick up a sticker that said, "Please no guns in God's house." You know, I would actually like to be able to say to my congregation, I think it would be great if we could be a no weapons zone. I think it would make it a good statement about our beliefs, about who we are, but that's not something I could assume would go over. I think that there's a good chance that there would be some people who would say, now, wait a minute, I served in the military, what have you got against guns? Because I think there's a lot of kind of knee-jerk reaction conversation around the whole issue.
So in your current community, you think there are probably quite a variety of views on guns in the community you serve.
Yeah, I haven't been in my community long enough to know. I certainly wouldn't speak for them without having had some conversation about it.
Okay, right. You're relatively new to the community that you're serving.
Yes.
Let me try and pose this question in a way that reflects the nuance of the conversation. And if my question doesn't, then I hope that you will try to help me with that. But if we could bring someone into this conversation who might take a critical view toward some of the concerns that you just had, or maybe your statements about increased gun control or increased background checks. Let's just try and imagine a person who might have opposing arguments to those things. What do you think that person might hypothetically misunderstand about you and your position?
That's an interesting question. I think that someone who would oppose me on that point of view might have had personal experiences where they felt threatened and felt the need to have a weapon with them at all times, or felt the need to have access to firearms. I would want to hear their story. I would hope that we could actually share some stories, because I think that it's easy to come down on the side of one issue or another without listening to situations, without listening to stories. There's a lot of fear that people bring to this conversation. And people have had, they have many people have had experiences with firearms that engender a lot of anxiety. So I think we ought to be finding ways to get those stories out on the table, to be dealing with each other as human beings and not just as proponents of a position. I think that's the only way we're going to move forward.
Thank you for that response. Last question is it may be more just an invitation, I think. Is there anything that you feel like you want to say that you maybe didn't get to say, or respond to a question that I haven't asked but you think that I should have asked? I just want to open it up and see if there are any final things you want to say.
Now, why don't we leave it at that, because we could go on for a long time.
Well, Pastor, I have really appreciated your willingness to talk and to contribute and to give such thoughtful and meaningful answers. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.